I've covered a lot of hearings on this channel, watched politicians dodge questions, bury answers under statistics, and turn simple accountability into 10-minute speeches. But I have never covered a hearing that looked quite like this one. 304 pages about Gavin Newsom, 304 pages explaining Gavin Newsom, defending Gavin Newsom, celebrating Gavin Newsom, and yet Donald Trump reduced the entire book to one brutal sentence that cut through every polished paragraph. 304 pages about you, not one page brought anyone home. Gavin Newsom opened his mouth, but for once the famous rhythm did not arrive. The practiced answer did not appear, and the voice that had survived interviews, debates, press conferences, and television panels suddenly had nowhere useful to go. He looked down at the book sitting in front of him, his own book, his own photograph, his own name across the cover, then closed it with both hands and pressed his palms against the title as if the problem were not what had just been said, but the fact that the evidence was sitting directly beneath his fingers. The title was Young Man in a Hurry, and before this hearing was finished, that title would sound less like clever marketing and more like the most revealing sentence Gavin Newsom had ever allowed a publisher to print. 12 minutes earlier, however, Gavin Newsom had entered the room with none of that hesitation, carrying a copy under his arm with the confidence of a politician who expected the book to function as an achievement rather than an exhibit. He placed it beside his microphone, smiled across the table at Donald Trump, and carried himself exactly the way his public image had trained audiences to expect. Smooth, prepared, camera aware, and absolutely certain that whatever came next could be answered. At the opposite end of the table, Trump already had another copy of the same book, except his copy contained 3 sticky notes, 3 marked locations inside 304 pages, and those tabs mattered because Trump was not preparing to debate Gavin Newsom's image in the abstract. He was preparing to use Gavin Newsom's own presentation of Gavin Newsom against the record that the hearing had placed around him. That distinction became obvious almost immediately because instead of beginning with some sprawling ideological argument, Trump thanked him for coming, made the familiar jab about the book tour, podcasts, Davos, and a packed schedule, then moved directly to the question underneath all the performance. California receives enormous federal support, so what did Gavin Newsom actually do with it? Newsom responded the way Gavin Newsom usually responds when a question threatens to become painfully specific. He widened the frame until the original point was almost buried beneath accomplishments, scale, and polished numbers. He talked about California being the 5th largest economy, about doubling the firefighting budget, about a 9% reduction in homelessness, and every phrase arrived with the familiar speed and confidence that makes an answer sound complete before anyone has had time to notice what was never answered. It was technically responsive enough to keep moving, rhetorically smooth enough to sound impressive, and politically useful, because statistics are much safer than individual people whose lives cannot be summarized by a percentage point. While Newsom spoke, Trump turned one page of the book. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just a small movement that carried strangely well in a room where everyone was beginning to understand that the book itself was going to matter. Then a congressman requested 60 seconds and held up a letter he said had arrived that morning, and suddenly the argument moved away from GDP, budgets, and statewide percentages toward one 71-year-old man from Fresno. The letter described the man's wife entering a nursing home in March 2020, during the period when Gavin Newsom's administration imposed visitor restrictions as California responded to COVID. For 9 months, according to the account read into the room, her husband drove to that facility day after day, stood outside the window, and pressed his hand against the glass because physical contact with his wife had been replaced by a barrier and a policy. Some days she recognized that he was there, some days she apparently did not, and in December 2020, she died without him being allowed to hold her hand. The timing was what made the letter politically devastating inside the logic of this hearing, because the congressman then reminded the room that the same week this man lost his wife, Gavin Newsom was dealing with the public fallout from the French Laundry dinner. Then came the detail that converted the story from something happening somewhere in California into something physically present in Washington. The congressman said the husband was sitting in the third row. Every camera turned toward an older man wearing a dark suit, and he did not wave, stand, gesture, or perform for the attention that had suddenly been placed on him. He simply looked toward Gavin Newsom, and that mattered because the hearing no longer had the luxury of treating the consequences of government decisions as abstract language contained in briefing papers. Newsom responded by expressing sympathy and then moving toward the broader argument that California's policies had saved lives, which was exactly the type of answer that had worked for him repeatedly because it returned the discussion to population-level claims rather than forcing him to remain with one individual experience. Trump listened, looked toward the man in the third row, then looked back toward the book, and the contrast was now impossible to miss. One object contained 304 pages of Gavin Newsom explaining Gavin Newsom, while the letter contained a few paragraphs about somebody who had actually lived under decisions Gavin Newsom signed. That was the moment the first sticky note stopped looking like a marker and started looking like a planned collision between Newsom's written self-image and the people the hearing was accusing him of overlooking. Trump picked up young man in a hurry and held the cover where the cameras could clearly see it, emphasizing the obvious fact that these were not opposition research documents, leaked emails, anonymous claims, or somebody else's interpretation of Gavin Newsom. This was Gavin Newsom's book, marketed around Gavin Newsom's childhood, Gavin Newsom's ambitions, Gavin Newsom's values, Gavin Newsom's political development, and Gavin Newsom's preferred version of what his career meant. Trump's argument was brutally simple. 304 pages had enough room for memories, aspirations, leadership claims, personal reflections, and carefully selected explanations, but apparently not enough room for the man sitting in the third row whose wife died behind a nursing home window during policies signed by Newsom. Instead of reading the marked passage himself, Trump slid the book across the table and told Newsom to read it because the point would land harder if the words entered the record in the author's own voice. Gavin Newsom opened to the first sticky note, page 73, because refusing to read from his own memoir in front of cameras would have created a problem even larger than whatever Trump had marked. The passage was about California and Newsom's connection to it, written in the confident language of belonging, permanence, loyalty, and a relationship with the state presented as lifelong and deeply personal. Newsom read the words strongly because they were his words, crafted for exactly this purpose, to communicate that California was not simply the state he governed, but the place that defined him. Trump let the passage settle, praised the language, then told Newsom to turn to the back cover, where the publishing material presented something far less poetic and much more inconvenient. There was the book tour schedule, a list that included Nashville, Atlanta, Rock Hill in South Carolina, New York, Las Vegas, Portsmouth in New Hampshire, Miami, and London. The contradiction Trump wanted the room to see required almost no embellishment, because Newsom was physically holding both sides of it. One part of the book presented an almost immovable attachment to California, while another advertised the long list of places he was leaving California to promote a book about that attachment. That was why Gavin Newsom did not immediately produce the kind of seamless response audiences had seen from him hundreds of times, because this was not a statistic he could counter with another statistic or a partisan accusation he could dismiss as partisan theater. The book was the evidence being used against the book, the author was being asked to reconcile the author, and the publisher had conveniently printed the travel schedule beside the larger message of devotion that the memoir was selling. Trump did not need to explain the contradiction for 5 minutes because the visual argument was already sitting in Newsom's hands, page 73 on one side and the itinerary on the other. That is what made the moment sting. Gavin Newsom was not being confronted with somebody else's description of him. He was being confronted with two versions of himself packaged inside the same product. And the title Young Man in a Hurry was beginning to acquire a different meaning because the question was no longer whether Gavin Newsom loved California, but whether his political movement increasingly pointed somewhere beyond it. Trump then widened the attack from the printed itinerary to the voters who had been watching Gavin Newsom leave the state, appear on national platforms, attend major events, and build a profile far larger than the office he already held. His accusation was that the problem was not simply traveling, because governors travel and politicians promote books, but believing that ordinary Californians were not keeping track of the distance between what Newsom said about them and where his attention appeared to be going. Trump pointed back toward the man in the third row, invoked the shop owner in Bakersfield, and invoked older residents selling homes because they could no longer afford the state, tying all of them into the same accusation of political absence. The argument was sharp because it converted Newsom's national visibility from an asset into evidence of misplaced priority, suggesting that every polished appearance somewhere else raised the same question about who was waiting back home. For a moment, it looked as though page 73 might be enough to define the entire hearing. But Gavin Newsom was not going to lose the room quietly, and he did what experienced politicians do when an opponent has successfully chosen the battlefield. He changed the battlefield. Newsom fired back by turning to the January 2025 Los Angeles fires, the destruction of roughly 10,000 homes, Trump's visit, the public promise of rapid FEMA relief, and the accusation that families later spent months waiting while federal assistance moved too slowly. It was a serious counterattack because it forced the issue of absence back onto Trump, replacing the question of where Newsom had been with the question of what the federal government had done after Californians watched entire neighborhoods burn. For several seconds, the room shifted. Democratic staffers visibly reacted, reporters started writing faster, and Newsom appeared to have found the exact opening he needed to escape the book and put Trump on defense. And that was precisely when Trump refused the escape route. Because rather than drowning the hearing in a long argument over FEMA, he acknowledged the delay and brought the room straight back to the man from Fresno, asking the one question Newsom's counterattack had not answered. Did anyone from Gavin Newsom's office ever call him? Trump did not allow the FEMA counterattack to become a new hearing, because the entire point of what he was doing depended on refusing Gavin Newsom the luxury of changing subjects every time the subject became uncomfortable. He acknowledged that FEMA had been slow, stripped Newsom of the easiest argument by conceding the obvious, then immediately returned to the 71-year-old man from Fresno and the question Newsom still had not answered. Did anyone in Gavin Newsom's office call him even once after his wife died under restrictions Newsom had signed and defended? That was the counterpunch, and it landed because it reduced a sprawling debate about agencies, timelines, federal bureaucracy, and partisan blame back to the one thing Newsom's statistical language could not absorb without becoming grotesque: an individual human being sitting only a few rows away. In 3 seconds, the room was no longer debating whose bureaucracy moved slower. It was looking at the gap between political responsibility described from a podium and personal responsibility experienced by somebody who had buried his wife. Then, Trump lowered his voice and made clear that the detour was over because the hearing was not going to become a referendum on him when the book sitting between them still had 2 sticky notes left. The first marked page had already established the central contradiction between Gavin Newsom's self-written attachment to California and the national itinerary printed inside the same object. But Trump was not finished because page 73 had only been about where Newsom said he belonged. The second sticky note, page 142, went after something much harder to separate from a political identity: who Gavin Newsom claimed to have been during COVID. Newsom turned to the marked page and began reading again, and this time the language was not about belonging, ambition, or affection for California, but about leadership during the most disruptive public health crisis in modern American life. In his own framing, he had guided nearly 40 million people through an unprecedented emergency, made difficult decisions, accepted the burden of lockdowns, mask requirements, school closures, and restrictions, and presented those choices as the hard work of leadership under impossible circumstances. The passage was polished because memoirs are polished, and it described the pandemic the way victorious generals describe campaigns after the smoke has cleared, emphasizing necessity, resolve, and the decisions the author wants history to remember. Trump let Newsom read every word because interrupting would have weakened the contrast that was coming, and when Newsom finished, Trump simply restated what the page claimed. Gavin Newsom led California through COVID, and that was the version of the story he had chosen to preserve in print. Then, Trump asked the question that turned a self-congratulatory leadership narrative into a chronology, because chronology is where political mythology often starts losing oxygen. When exactly was that page written, and what had Gavin Newsom been doing in November 2020 while telling millions of Californians what sacrifice required? That month mattered because Newsom had urged Californians to restrict Thanksgiving gatherings. Churches faced restrictions, nursing homes remained subject to visitor rules, families were canceling travel, grandparents were settling for screens, and people who desperately wanted normal contact were being told that responsible citizenship meant staying apart. The rules had consequences precisely because people obeyed them, and that obedience is what made the French Laundry episode so politically poisonous rather than merely embarrassing. Families canceled dinners they had planned for months. Parents called adult children and told them not to come home. Grandparents watched grandchildren through FaceTime, and people accepted that the cost of doing the right thing was distance from the people they loved. In that same period, Newsom attended the now infamous dinner at the French Laundry with a group of people at a restaurant where the price point alone made the scene look like a caricature of elite exemption. Trump emphasized the details the original controversy had already made notorious: roughly a dozen people, an expensive meal, lobbyists, the absence of the kind of restraint being demanded from ordinary Californians, and photographs that made the initial explanations harder to sustain. Newsom had called it a mistake, but Trump's attack was that the real problem was not simply one bad dinner, it was the hierarchy revealed by the dinner. Rules for the population, flexibility for the people who wrote, defended, or moved comfortably around those rules. That distinction was the knife, because Newsom's defense had always depended on treating French Laundry as a lapse in judgment rather than evidence of a deeper attitude toward power. Trump refused that framing and pushed the hypocrisy argument harder, pointing out that Newsom had initially described the event in ways that critics believed the photographs contradicted, and that saying mistake afterward did not erase what the public had already seen. Then he moved from restaurants to schools, because this was where the resentment of 2020 became more personal for families who had watched children spend month after month in front of laptops, while politicians spoke abstractly about safety. California's public schools were heavily disrupted, children lost classroom time, parents reorganized jobs around remote learning, and families with fewer resources bore costs that affluent households could manage more easily. Against that background, the script placed Newsom's own children in private school settings that had access to in-person education, turning the issue from one evening of elite privilege into a broader accusation that the governor's family had options unavailable to many of the families living under the system he administered. Newsom's jaw tightened because this was no longer a debate about whether pandemic restrictions were justified in some general public health sense, and that distinction was exactly why the attack was effective. Trump was not asking the room to relitigate every mask rule every closure, or every epidemiological estimate. He was asking whether the person demanding sacrifice had lived under sacrifice on the same terms as the people receiving the orders. Newsom reached for the explanation he had used before, that French Laundry had been a mistake, that he had taken responsibility, that he had acknowledged the error publicly, but Trump treated that language as another polished escape hatch. In Trump's framing, saying, "I take responsibility after violating the spirit of your own restrictions," is not responsibility if nothing material changes, and if the people who followed the restrictions still carry the consequences years later. That was the accusation, now sitting underneath page 142. Newsom had written the chapter where leadership was measured by the rules he imposed, while the hearing was measuring leadership by whether he had lived under those rules with the same discipline he demanded from everybody else. Then Trump turned away from Newsom and toward the camera, and that change in direction mattered because the target of the next argument was not the man at the table, but the millions of people who had lived through 2020 and did not need the year explained to them. He asked how many people watching had skipped Thanksgiving because they listened, how many had stayed away from grandchildren at Christmas because they believed the warnings, how many had funerals reduced to screens, windows, distance, and procedures that made grief feel bureaucratic. He returned again to the people with relatives in nursing homes, the families who had stood outside windows, the people who had complied not because they were weak or gullible, but because government officials told them compliance would protect others. And then he contrasted those memories with the French Laundry dinner, campaign-connected company, expensive food, and the image of a governor whose own family appeared to possess educational options that ordinary families did not. The argument was deliberately merciless because it accused Newsom not simply of inconsistency, but of asking Californians to experience one version of the pandemic while living inside another. In the third row, the old man from Fresno looked down at his hands, and the visual carried more force than any statistic, because those hands had once been pressed against the glass of a nursing home window while his wife remained on the other side. The hearing had now circled back to him twice, first through the letter and now through the broader memory of restrictions, which meant the man was no longer a side detail, but the human standard against which Newsom's memoir was being tested. Trump returned to the book and made the comparison explicit. 304 pages, a full chapter defending COVID leadership, yet no French Laundry in the heroic version, no serious reckoning with the private school contrast, none of the scenes critics believed defined the hypocrisy of the period. The memoir, in Trump's telling, contained the version where Gavin Newsom was the responsible leader making hard calls for everybody else, while the people who lived through those calls remembered a more complicated and much uglier picture. And that was when the second sticky note finished its work, because the room was no longer reading page 142 as a chapter about leadership. It was reading it as evidence of how carefully Gavin Newsom had edited himself. The room went quiet in the way political rooms rarely do, not because everyone suddenly agreed about COVID policy, but because nearly everyone had some personal memory attached to that year, and the argument had moved into territory statistics could not completely control. There were people who remembered empty churches, people who remembered canceled holidays, people who remembered children learning through frozen laptop screens, people who remembered nursing homes, people who remembered death without the rituals that normally make death bearable. Trump's advantage in that moment was that he did not need all of those people to agree with every criticism of Newsom. He only needed them to remember what sacrifice felt like and then compare that feeling to the images of elite exception. Newsom could defend the policy logic, defend the public health rationale, defend the unprecedented nature of the emergency, and still be stuck with the much simpler question of whether the people making the rules had obeyed the spirit of those rules themselves. And, sitting on the table between them, young man in a hurry still had one sticky note left. And that final sticky note was sitting on the title page, the simplest marker in the entire book. And according to the logic Trump had been building all morning, the one that mattered most because it did not require a complicated policy argument, a spreadsheet, or another committee exhibit. Trump picked up the book, held the cover where the cameras could read it, and slowly repeated the title Gavin Newsom had chosen for his own memoir, Young Man in a Hurry. Then he looked directly at Newsom and reduced the entire 304-page exercise in political self-definition to the simplest question of the hearing: in a hurry to go where? That question worked because the title had been designed to communicate energy, ambition, momentum, and urgency. All the qualities a politician wants attached to his name when he is selling a national image. Trump's attack was that urgency becomes something very different when voters begin asking whether the politician is moving urgently toward their problems or urgently toward his next opportunity. Trump began listing the places where, in his framing, that urgency had not appeared when California needed it most, and he did it without allowing Newsom to retreat into the broad language of leadership that had protected him on page 142. Not in a hurry to reach Los Angeles when neighborhoods were burning, not in a hurry to Sacramento when the deficit climbed toward $45 billion, not in a hurry to pick up the phone when ordinary Californians believed they were being ignored, but apparently always in a hurry when the destination was national exposure. He set the book down flat and turned the title into an accusation, saying Newsom appeared eager to reach Davos, New Hampshire, interviews, podcasts, and every stage capable of expanding a political identity beyond California. The point was not that a governor must never travel or speak outside his state, because that would have been too easy to dismiss, but that the pattern described by the script made those trips look different when placed beside fires, deficits, closures, and people who felt abandoned. In Trump's framing, Young Man in a Hurry stopped sounding like a flattering description of drive and started sounding like evidence that Gavin Newsom had been hurrying away from the responsibilities that supposedly justified the book in the first place. Then Trump introduced the publishing delay, another detail that made the title more damaging because the script connected Newsom's personal ambition to one of California's most painful recent disasters. The book, Trump said, had originally been intended for an earlier release, but the publisher delayed it after the Los Angeles fires, explaining that the decision was made out of respect for victims who had lost homes and livelihoods. That delay mattered because the publisher, in this telling, had demonstrated a restraint Trump was accusing the author himself of lacking. The book could wait because California was hurting. 1 year later, when the publication finally moved forward, Trump pointed to the travel schedule again and asked where Newsom went during the first week, emphasizing Nashville, Atlanta, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Miami, and the collection of destinations that immediately carried national political significance. In other words, the publisher could decide that Gavin Newsom's story should temporarily step aside for Californians who had lost everything, but the accusation was that Gavin Newsom's ambition returned to the front of the line the moment the release calendar reopened. Trump pushed that distinction harder by noting that these were not random stops scattered across a normal promotional itinerary, but places any experienced political observer would recognize as valuable terrain for someone cultivating a presidential profile. New Hampshire was not just another bookstore market. South Carolina was not just another collection of readers, and a schedule that moved repeatedly through politically important states could not help but invite questions about what Newsom was actually promoting: a memoir, a national brand, or the beginnings of something larger. The argument was devastating inside the structure of the hearing because it tied the back cover itinerary directly to the title page sticky note and made both of them reinforce the suspicion Trump had been building since page 73. Newsom had written about devotion to California, written about leadership through COVID, and chosen a title celebrating urgency. But Trump was now claiming that the clearest urgency in the entire book appeared in the author's movement toward national attention. That was why the line, "The book could wait, your ambition couldn't," landed with more force than a normal campaign insult because it condensed the publishing delay, the disaster, the tour schedule, and the presidential speculation into one sentence. For a moment, the room seemed to absorb every location Trump had named, because each stop could now be interpreted through the same question. Why was the governor of California appearing everywhere? Political ambition traditionally takes a man who wants to become more than governor of California. Every speech outside the state became easier to frame as distance from the people inside it. Every podcast became easier to cast as brand management. Every national appearance became another opportunity for critics to say the governor was rehearsing for an office he did not yet hold. Trump connected that imagery to small businesses in Bakersfield, residents dealing with high costs, homeowners affected by fire, and families waiting for government responses that felt slower than Newsom's national schedule. The indictment was not simply that Newsom wanted higher office, because ambition by itself is hardly unusual in Washington. It was that the script portrayed ambition as the one responsibility he approached with unquestionable urgency, while other responsibilities were described as things Californians were forced to wait on. That was the transformation of young man in a hurry from branding into prosecution. Hurry became motive, itinerary became evidence, and the memoir became the object that allowed Trump to connect them. Then Trump moved from policy failures and travel schedules to the deeper accusation that had been sitting underneath the entire exchange, one far more personal than deficits, fires, or book tours, because it challenged the authenticity of Newsom's public persona itself. People do not hate a governor simply because a governor fails, Trump argued, because governors fail constantly, policies fail, agencies fail, predictions fail, budgets collapse, disasters overwhelm systems, and voters understand that political office does not create omnipotence. What makes resentment harden into something more permanent, according to Trump's attack, is the belief that the politician performed concern so effectively that people almost believed it, only to discover later that the performance and the priority were never the same thing. That was the line of argument into which every earlier piece now fit. The nursing home restrictions, the man from Fresno, French Laundry, private schooling, the national travel, the delayed memoir, and the places Newsom chose to visit after publication. Trump was no longer accusing Newsom of one hypocritical dinner or one poorly timed trip. He was accusing him of building an entire political identity around empathy while repeatedly demonstrating in the script's framing that Gavin Newsom remained the first person Gavin Newsom was hurrying to serve. He invoked Davos and the image of Newsom holding a glass of champagne while Californians affected by disaster were still dealing with temporary living arrangements, unanswered questions, and the long administrative aftermath that rarely appears in political memoirs. Trump's attack sharpened around the familiar frustration of voters who watch politicians speak confidently on national television while their own neighborhoods remain unchanged, and who are then told by family members, commentators, and political opponents that their distrust is exaggerated or partisan. In the script, Trump gave those people the validation they believed they had been denied, telling them they were not wrong to notice the difference between a politician's words and the pattern of his decisions. That was why the accusation about pretending to care was more dangerous than accusing Newsom of simple incompetence, because incompetence can be defended with statistics, circumstances, and shared blame, while insincerity attacks the credibility required for every future explanation. Once an audience concludes that the concern itself is an act, every polished answer becomes suspicious, every emotional statement becomes performance, and even genuine achievements become harder to separate from the machinery of personal advancement. Trump returned his attention to the book because after nearly 12 minutes, the object had become far more than a memoir sitting on a hearing table and had effectively become the organizing document of the prosecution he was conducting. Page 73 had been used to challenge the image of permanent devotion to California. Page 142 had been used to challenge the heroic presentation of COVID leadership, and the title page had been used to challenge the destination of Newsom's ambition. 3 sticky notes, 3 carefully selected pressure points, and not one of them required Trump to invent new language for Gavin Newsom because the attack depended almost entirely on language Newsom had chosen for himself. The book was supposed to explain who Gavin Newsom was, but Trump's argument was that the omissions explained even more than the chapters. No page for the French Laundry contradiction, no meaningful place for the private school contrast, no page for the man in Fresno, no chapter organized around the Californians who believed the governor's ambitions had repeatedly moved faster than their needs. And once that framework was established, Trump no longer needed another sticky note, because all that remained was to deliver the sentence he had been building toward from the moment Gavin Newsom carried young man in a hurry into the room. He looked down at the book, then back at Newsom, and the performance that had begun with jokes about podcasts and book tours was gone, replaced by the quieter tone the script had been moving toward all morning. The room had already heard Newsom read his own declarations, watched the itinerary collide with page 73, watched French Laundry collide with page 142, and watched the title collide with the political map printed behind it. Now Trump compressed every contradiction, every omission, every accusation of absence, every family waiting, every burned neighborhood, every person who believed they had been governed from a distance into a single measurement of the memoir's value. 304 pages existed to tell the country what Gavin Newsom wanted the country to know about Gavin Newsom, yet Trump's final argument was that none of those pages had done the one thing leadership was supposed to do for the people whose lives had supplied the consequences. And then he delivered the line the entire hearing had been moving toward. 304 pages about you. Not one page brought anyone home. The line landed, and for the first time all morning, Gavin Newsom did not have a sentence waiting behind his expression, did not have a statistic ready to redirect the room, did not have a polished counterattack prepared to turn the pressure back towards someone else. He opened his mouth and began with, "Mr. President, in the same smooth reflex that had carried him through decades of cameras, interviews, debates, crises, and carefully managed confrontations, but the sentence stopped before it became an answer. Nobody interrupted him, nobody cut his microphone, nobody shouted over him, and that was precisely why the silence became so severe. The machine simply failed to produce the next line when the next line was needed most." Newsom looked down toward young man in a hurry, the book still lying between the two men with his name across the cover and the marked pages now stripped of the meaning he had intended them to have when he wrote them. Then he closed the book slowly with both hands and pressed his palms against the cover, against his own name, against 304 pages that moments earlier had been a campaign asset and were now functioning like an exhibit he wished he could remove from the table. There was nothing theatrical about the gesture, and that was exactly what made it more damaging than shouting, anger, or some exaggerated collapse would have been. Newsom did not throw the book away, did not slam it shut, did not rise from the table or accuse Trump of staging a stunt, because any of those reactions would have given him movement, and movement is often how experienced politicians escape a moment they cannot verbally control. Instead, he remained seated with both hands flat on the cover, holding the object in place as if keeping it closed might somehow seal back inside everything he had just been forced to read into the record. For nearly his entire public career, Gavin Newsom had survived pressure by filling space faster than his opponents could define it, using speed, tone, confidence, statistics, and framing to keep the audience moving with him even when the original question remained unanswered. Now the room contained the rarest thing in Newsom's political vocabulary: empty space, and because he could not immediately fill it, everyone else was free to decide what the silence meant. The chairman leaned toward the microphone and asked whether the governor wished to continue, giving Newsom one last procedural opening to reclaim the floor and produce the recovery he had failed to produce seconds earlier. Every camera remained fixed. The reporters waited. The old man from Fresno remained in the third row, and the entire hearing seemed to hang on whether Newsom could restart the familiar rhythm one more time. He looked at the closed book and finally answered with 2 words: "No further." Those words were not dramatic on paper, but inside the structure of the hearing they carried enormous weight because Gavin Newsom had spent the morning trying to prove that he always had more context, more explanation, more statistics, more history, and more reasons than the accusation allowed. Now, after 3 sticky notes and 1 sentence about 304 pages, there was suddenly nothing further he wanted to put into the record. He did not stand, did not immediately leave, did not reach for water, lean toward an aide, or perform any of the small mechanical gestures politicians use to make an uncomfortable pause look temporary rather than final. He remained seated because walking out would have turned Trump's accusation about absence into a physical image, and staying meant accepting the silence that had already swallowed the room. The charm had not repaired the contradiction. The national statistics had not erased the man in the third row. The FEMA attack had not moved the hearing permanently away from the memoir. And the COVID defense had not removed French Laundry from the public memory the script was forcing back into view. For the first time in the sequence, the problem was not that Newsom lacked enough words, but that every available category of words had already been used and placed beside something harder to explain. So he sat with the cover closed and his hands resting over his own name, while a room accustomed to political noise watched silence become the most memorable answer of the morning. Within the hour, according to the script, the moment that spread fastest was not even the line Trump delivered, but the image that followed it. Gavin Newsom closing the book and pressing both hands over the cover. The clip required almost no explanation, because the visual carried its own interpretation. A politician who had written hundreds of pages about himself appearing to physically cover the name on the object that had just been turned against him. It looped because repetition made the symbolism easier, not harder, to understand. Hands down, cover closed, name partially hidden, voice gone, the same 10 seconds replayed until the gesture looked less like an incidental movement and more like the natural ending of the entire confrontation. In the script's framing, there was no caption capable of improving the image because the audience already knew what had happened before the hands came down. 3 pages had been opened, 3 contradictions had been emphasized, and when the book finally shut, the argument shut with it. That evening, the script emphasizes another silence, this one outside the hearing room, claiming that no major Democratic leader rushed forward with an immediate public defense capable of changing the meaning of what had happened. In politics, silence can be strategic, cautious, temporary, or simply the product of people deciding that a bad moment becomes worse when everybody repeats it. But inside this narrative, the silence is treated as a verdict. The point is not that every absence of comment proves agreement, but that Newsom, a politician built for national attention, had just suffered a nationally visible confrontation, and suddenly there was no chorus powerful enough to replace the image of him shutting his own book. The man who had entered carrying young man in a hurry like a credential was now being defined by the moment he closed it. And Trump did not need another statement that night because the replay was already doing the work for him. After the hearing, the old man from Fresno walked out of the Rayburn building and past the reporters, staffers, cameras, and vehicles without becoming part of the media machinery that had turned the room into a national spectacle. Nobody surrounded him because he was never supposed to be the celebrity in this story, never supposed to have a platform, a book tour, a national podcast circuit, or a line of people waiting to quote him. He was simply the man described in the letter, the man who had driven to a nursing home day after day for 9 months, placed his hand against a window, and watched the woman he loved from the wrong side of a policy barrier. He stood on the steps in the dark suit the script describes as something he had not worn since December 2020, and the significance of his presence was precisely that he had entered the hearing carrying no political ambition at all. He had come to sit where Gavin Newsom could see at least one person whose experience could not be converted into a statewide percentage without losing the meaning of what had happened. For that man, the hearing was never really about whether Trump won a television moment or whether Newsom lost one because the argument had started years earlier in a nursing home parking lot. He had already lived the part of the story politicians now debated, already experienced the distance between a public health order and the human cost of obeying it, already stood outside the glass long before anyone placed a sticky note inside Gavin Newsom's memoir. The script imagines him looking upward on those steps as if speaking toward the person who was no longer there, carrying the knowledge that he had finally watched the governor who signed the restrictions sit across the room from the consequences those restrictions represented. He had not needed to testify because his presence had become testimony, and he had not needed to challenge Newsom because Trump had already forced the book, the dates, the dinner, the school contrast, and the political itinerary into the same frame. When Newsom closed the cover, the man from Fresno had seen something he had waited years to see. Not revenge, but a moment when a politician could no longer outrun the human meaning of a decision with another polished explanation. Across America that night, the script turns back toward the people who had carried similar memories from 2020, the people who skipped holidays, watched funerals through screens, stood outside windows, closed businesses, rearranged family life, and believed they were doing what government officials asked because sacrifice was supposed to apply to everybody. Some had spent years arguing at dinner tables with children, grandchildren, neighbors, and friends about whether political leaders truly understood what ordinary people had endured, and many had grown tired of being told their resentment was merely partisan or exaggerated. The hearing gave that resentment a physical object, a book about Gavin Newsom, written by Gavin Newsom, closed by Gavin Newsom after Donald Trump used Gavin Newsom's own presentation of himself to attack the distance between image and conduct. The title remained visible even when the pages were shut. Young Man in a Hurry. In a hurry, the script concludes, but not in a hurry for the people who believed they had spent years waiting. That is why the story, in the framing of the original script, is supposed to stay with the audience longer than an ordinary political confrontation because its final image is not Trump speaking, but a silent politician with both hands over his own name and an ordinary man walking alone out of the building afterward. The entire hearing had begun with a 304-page memoir and ended with the argument that no amount of autobiography can substitute for the people who measure leadership by what happened to them rather than what a politician writes about himself. Trump's final line worked because it compressed every charge the script had built, from the Fresno nursing home to French Laundry, from private school access to the National Book Tour, from Los Angeles to New Hampshire, into one accusation about who was actually being served by all that ambition. 304 pages about you. Not one page brought anyone home. And in the world of this script, 304 pages about Gavin Newsom were ultimately worth less than 12 minutes spent forcing those pages to answer for the people they left out.